Hello, Garth.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. And you? How are you?
Good.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Yeah, in
Where are you?
Tokyo. Now I'm in Tokyo.
Okay,
Japan. Yeah,
cool.
good morning for you. But here it's already night, but it's okay. So thank you very much for taking the time for talking to us. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'm Alain from the blog One Book a Day. So actually, our audience is mainly focused on Spanish speakers. So we mainly focus on books that are written in Spanish or translated to Spanish. So in your case, yeah, your novel City on Fire. So it's the one translated in Spanish, and hopefully your new book, The Second Coming. I hope that will be translated in Spanish, right? Will
Yes, me
release.
too.
Yeah. So thank you very much. So first, I'd like to thank you in the name of the all the members of the blog. And yeah, I'm happy to talk about some of your work, particularly as I mentioned the book City on Fire. Maybe your opinions in the literary yeah world. So
Okay.
first of all, I'm curious about the yeah with the release of your book Second Coming. So I mean, you are now in a completely different situation from when you released City on Fire. I mean, from the City on Fire, maybe the public was kind of skeptical or surprised with this very young, ambitious writer to read this kind of big novel. And in this case, yeah, you're already established, well recognized writer, right? So I was wondering, what's the main difference that you approach this kind of situations in the City on Fire and now with the Second Coming?
I would say as a writer,
Mm,
your life kind of cleaves or divides into three regions.
mm,
You have your writing life where you're alone in a room
mm,
and alone with your imagination, alone with your memories, alone with the writers you admire, and alone with some idea of a reader who is almost like a personality, but without a face,
mm,
whom you're talking to. Then you have the region of your life which is, going to the bank, brushing your teeth, dropping your children off at school, and um, those two regions account for, like, 95% of my life. Then
mm,
there's this little teeny part, which is 5%, which
mm,
is, a kind of public life.
mm.
Um, and for writers, more than for most artists, I mean, it's just infinitesimal. So it doesn't take up very much of my consciousness,
Mm.
thinking about, what position, how does this look to the public? How do these readers, plural, how are they going to receive this book? One of the, you know, I would say in the middle region of my life, the brushing teeth and going to the bank region, um, that life looks a lot different than it did when I was a childless, you know, person
Mm.
living very cheaply, in New York City, writing this book that nobody knew about.
Mm.
Now I'm a middle-aged guy with, four children and a car and, like all these differences in my life. And less, um, there's less sort of like external pressure to get the work done. Um, because you kind of have a life that works for your family and your children, but that's as much of a curse as it is a blessing, and nothing that happens either in your public life or in your going to the bank and brushing your teeth life really changes what it is every day to sit down with a blank page.
Yeah, I will imagine that it will be the opposite. Like after this big success, that maybe you will feel some kind of burden for writing maybe a better book, or maybe yeah, trying to keep on with the expectations with the public and the critics, for example?
Well, that word success is very
Mm,
slippery.
mm,
And actually it translates differently across different languages, which I sort of like. In the Germanic language family, I think that success is like mixed up with the words for like luck and
mm,
happiness, like good fortune,
mm,
um, which sort of seems about right. But success could be, you know, again, in your public life, success could be having like this wide readership, but in your artistic life, if the book that you wrote isn't good, then the success in your public life isn't going to fulfill you. And so I definitely felt the pressure to exceed, to go beyond what I had done before. But that was, I mean that artistically. Like, I don't mean that in terms of anything public. I mean, the the public stuff around City on Fire was just a total fluke. It was a total luck, total
mm.
happenstance, and kind of what we say in English, lightning in a bottle. Like
Mm.
you can't go chasing that because it's just accidental. It's not. But in my, writing life, it was like I did want to make a book that was better to me as a writer and better to me as a reader. Um, so there was some pressure there, but a lot of the work in the writing life is to go into that room and shut the door and leave any kind of public expectations outside the door because you'll never write anything good if you feel the world is looking over your shoulder.
I see. And now that you mentioned before these writers that you admire, so yeah, a lot of reviews, a lot of probably in the interviews also, this kind of critics have compared your work to, and I think yourself also, for example, to influence Dickens, Foster Wallace, for example. But also there's this comparison because probably this kind of uh, goal or objective to write, maybe this is kind of cliche, this kind of American novel with, for example, Jonathan Franzen. So yeah, of course, I like to ask your opinion about this influence in your work, but also about the critics that has coming also from that kind of influence. For example, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, maybe this debate about, for example, I mentioned that Jonathan Franzen, some critics that his books are maybe have weak female characters, or probably he doesn't make clear moral positions for some kind of when the characters are misbehavior or some, for example.
Mhm.
Your case with City on Fire, yeah, I agree. You don't have this problem with weak female characters. Maybe one of the main characters are female, but there are a lot of this kind of moral ambiguity, right? So you don't feel, yeah. What I want to ask if you feel some kind of, um, yeah, this kind of pressure for make some clear moral statements or taking side or something like that.
So to go back to the first part of your
Mm,
question, the question of influence, you know, I read very widely and I love all kinds of things. I'm a very naive reader, like an amateur.
mm,
And I think that that's important to hold on to.
mm,
One of my least favorite things about writers as they grow older is that they get crotchety and like, only, want fiction to only be this way.
I see.
But the word novel, means new. And
Mm,
so I'm always looking for someone who's doing it differently. But you can't read, I don't think in English you can read Dickens or George Eliot without being influenced by them. I mean, you can't read them seriously.
okay.
You could decide not to read them, but Zadie Smith is a great, is engaged in a great conversation with Dickens and George Eliot.
Mm,
The same for the modernists, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, those are very important writers to me. And then when I was looking around uh in like the 90s at who's making this new in a new way. Don DeLillo was a writer I really loved. Norman Rush is a novelist I really love. So they were important to me. But I also read a lot of literature and translation. So like um, particularly the two big Bolaño books, Savage Detectives
Mm.
and 2666,
Mm.
were very, very instrumental in me being able to write City on Fire.
Mm.
And I don't know what the debate that you're sketching looks like in Spanish because,
Mm.
Bolaño's characters are always behaving badly
Yeah.
in some way or another. But um, I don't know that he makes big moral statements.
Mm.
A novel, I don't think, is really a place for judgment.
Mm.
Or the judgment belongs to the reader. It's a
Okay.
place for perception. And if you're not willing to let your characters make mistakes or do things that are um, frustrating to the reader, you're kind of prejudicing the reader. You're not really allowing them to know your character in all the character's,
Mm.
fullness and reach their own conclusion. So I don't feel a great desire to rush in and answer questions. I feel a tremendous pressure to find the questions that will be interesting to the reader.
Yeah, I see. For example, you mentioned this kind of moral situations. So I'm trying not to be very aware of that while you're writing. For example, some characters in City on Fires, there are kind of different backgrounds, and also, yeah, like different lifestyles. One of the things that caught my attention was this relationship between two of the main characters that was not only homosexual relationship, but also was like interracial, right? So I was wondering if did you have any challenge how to portray these kind of relationships like in that period for the 70s, right? So how to approach that from the eyes of today's, let's say, political environment or something like that?
No, I mean I had an uncle, a great uncle, my grandfather's brother, was from Lake Charles, Louisiana, which is the deep South,
Mm. Mm.
and he was gay. And I was spending a lot of time with him at the end of his life, around the time I was starting City on Fire.
Mm.
And his partner was from Alabama, also in the deep South. And I thought that talking about looking at New York, I mean, I didn't even really approach it schematically. Like I just had this character of Mercer and I had this character of William,
Mm.
and I knew
Mm.
they were in love. And um, but I also felt on some level that to write a novel of New York at this length, a big fresco, and to
Mm.
not, make room to have everyone be, you know, heterosexuals having, missionary position, monogamous sex is like not really accurate to the city, nor to the 70s, nor to part of what I wanted to look at, which is freedom and the cost of freedom. So I think I was drawing some of what I was perceiving about my uncle,
Mm.
who had been, living a gay life in the city in the 70s, but closeted from his family,
Mm.
or a queer life, we'd say now in America. Um, and, you know, so I had that, I have gay friends, I have black
Mm.
friends. I have friends who are in interracial relationships,
Mm.
and any sort of pressure from the culture to attempt to write from within a demographic box.
Mm.
I mean, which makes all sorts of assumptions about me, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't actually know what my
Mm.
you can guess what my racial background is or what my
Mm.
sexuality is, but you really don't know.
Yeah.
And if you follow that far enough, it's like, am I supposed to not have women in the books?
Mm.
And so I just, any pressure from the culture about that, I think is pernicious and is ultimately toxic to art and to life.
Yeah.
At the
So
same time, I should say it is really important to acknowge that there's some kinds of experiences where you're making an imaginative leap. You're not,
mm,
you, you can't, if you write about them in a way that pretends to know something that you don't know, then
mm,
it will feel false to the reader. And that is an artistic crime. But there are these leaps that you can make, and you have an instinct that somehow you know something. Just like when you're in a marriage and you sort of know how your spouse is feeling without having talked about it yet.
yeah, so these different characters, so female characters, male characters from different backgrounds. So even yeah, there are a lot of people say that actually there's the same New York City plays kind of a character role. So and just putting the novel in the 70s. So also, as you mentioned, maybe you need this kind of leap of imagination. So to the period that you didn't live in, right? So do you think this kind of New York City from your novel from that 70s New York City, what is the main difference you find with today's New York City? So do you think the novel still has this kind of applies the situation of your novel in today's New York City, or it's completely changed this kind of
I didn't really think that I was writing a novel about New York in the 70s. I thought
mm,
I was writing a novel about New York, full stop, its personality. And in the same way that you get to see a character's personality most clearly when that character is in a moment of crisis,
mm, I see.
the same way that if you watch me brushing my teeth every day,
Mm,
you don't learn much about me
yeah.
because everybody brushes their teeth and it doesn't change. But if were to see me, my youngest child was in the intensive care unit in the hospital for a week a couple years ago. And if you'd seen me and my wife during that week, because we were sort of in crisis, you would have learned everything about it. All of the things that we carry inside us when we're brushing our teeth come to the surface when we're in crisis. And so I felt like I was just writing about this moment when the city was in a crisis that would force many of its defining characteristics and tensions and conflicts and qualities to the surface. So I didn't really write it as a historical novel or as an exercise in nostalgia.
Mm,
And when the first readers who read it, who were like editors and people who had been around in the 70s, read it, like I held my breath,
yeah.
like, did I get it right?
Mm,
But they connected with it like instantly because, they thought it was because I had all the details right, but I knew it was because they had seen what I thought I had seen
mm,
about the city in crisis. The crisis that I sort of watched was 2001. Um,
So you
and
think that today's New York City is not in crisis anymore, or has
oh,
different challenges?
I mean, it has different challenges, but anyone who tells you that it's in crisis is full of shit. I mean,
Mm,
New York in 2020,
mm,
when during lockdown, the pandemic, people thrown out of work,
mm,
everything shutting down. That was, that the tensions were very much on the surface. The characteristic of the city, and most places when they're not in crisis, is the tensions get tamped down and lied about, and
mm,
that's more where we're at, you know,
yeah.
right now. But like, yeah, I don't. I think it's risible. Yeah, I mean, we're in a presidential election, so there's this whole like
Mhm,
thing about like crime, out of control crime in cities. My wife is a criminal justice researcher. She'll tell you
mm,
like crime is at historic lows.
yeah.
What's really there is massive, massive inequality, but it's tamped down, it's hidden, it's not like erupting to the surface right now.
Yeah, so actually I'm living now in Japan, but I'm from Mexico City.
Hmm.
So yeah, there are a lot of things that probably can explain a lot of things from Mexico City right now, from nowadays, even if that novel is like set up in the 70s New York. So Mexico City is going through a challenge, for example, gentrification, so
Yes.
immigration with different racial backgrounds, also being like a strong Catholic background in Mexico, so also this kind of sexuality issues, the violence. So I think, yeah, I kind of identify these kind of things from New York City, from your novel, from the Mexico City nowadays, and probably, of course, from different cities of the world. So do you think so, or you identify this kind of issues in different places where you live or you have lived before?
Well, I kind of fancifully or romantically think that each of the world's great cities sort of has its own personality,
Oh, mm,
and it's its own way of expressing these universal tensions.
mm,
In the same way that, different characters in a novel, they can be different from you, the reader, and yet you feel like you're seeing your life
mm,
reflected in them. They can be different from each other, but they're all kind of going through the same thing. Mexico City, I am desperate to get to. I am like sort of in love with Mexico City from
mm,
afar. Um, there was a really, I, I kind of have this secondhand from Francisco Goldman, but it sounds like there was a really amazing kind of literary scene there that wasn't about like cocktail parties and stuff, but was more like, just writers in bars doing interesting things.
mm, yeah.
And great like filmmaking coming out of Mexico City, like the landscape. I've been reading Alvaro Enrique
Mm,
a lot, who I did an interview with, and he's wonderful on like
mm, mm,
origins of Mexico City. So I imagine it as not as being its own thing, like
mm,
not New York, in the way that Paris isn't New York and London's not New York and Berlin's not New York and Rome's not New York. But
mm,
all of these great cities are in conversation with each other because all of the things that make them great and all of the things that, all of the tensions that kind of animate them are kind of in conversation with each
yeah.
other, but given a kind of, you know, um, given a kind of layer of, you know, cultural uniqueness.
So now that you mentioned that, so different cities, different places has their own like personality, their own issues. So, for example, your novel City on Fire, like being labeled by a lot of people by like the very great American novel. Do you think you agree with this kind of label, or do you think that somehow it limits or the scope of your novel? Like American novel, like only focusing on that kind of aspect of the novel.
I mean, the novel is about, it's a love letter to cosmopolitanism in some
Mm,
way. I don't mean that in a kind of like what we'd say in America, like a kind of effete, like liberal cosmopolitanism, nor do I mean it in an imperial sense, like a love letter to cities that sit at the middle of vast cultural empires. I mean cosmopolitanism in the sense of like the idea that all the greatest things in life arise from the interactions of people from all over, and them kind of finding a way to get along and govern themselves and make larger projects together, and that should kind of very transparently, you know jump over the hurdle of parochial American,
mm,
American stuff. Like it's a very American novel in
yeah,
its
yeah,
in its details and textures and language, but the things that it's obsessed with are making connections with people, beyond those limiting factors.
And how in the aspect of the literature itself, so how do you see the literature, like state of the American writers right now? How do you see how do you think
I
about
don't
it?
I don't really know because, as that middle region of my life I talked about,
Mm,
where like, my taking my children to sports events just consumes vast amounts of my time. So
yes,
I'm
yes.
not as plugged in as I once was.
Mm,
Um, yeah, like I buy and read a lot of new fiction, but I don't have as much time to like kind of track what's out there.
mm,
Um, but I also think this thing has happened with the internet,
mm,
at least in the US, which sucks, which
mm,
is that all what used to be this very open internet. It's part of why I love what you're doing and why I agreed to this interview. Like, you know,
mm,
the idea of the open internet from like 15 years ago, where you would just stumble onto things serendipitously because there were no paywalls and there weren't these, you know, platforms that you have to stay inside. Each Facebook is a platform and Instagram is a platform, walled gardens.
mm,
That's
yeah.
how they make money.
Mm,
And then you have things that are not walled gardens, like, publications, magazines, newspapers, but they have paywalls. So you can't, there's the cross pollination isn't there.
yeah.
So in addition to me being, you know, at midlife and kind of busier, I just think there's also less opportunity
Mm,
to kind of stumble onto things or to get a sense of what the pulse of the culture is. Like,
mm,
ask anyone what's going on in the world, and it depends on what algorithms are feeding things to them.
yeah. Yeah.
To the
Completely.
degree that I can judge, I think that this issue of, writing from fact and
Mm,
from inside your identity and from, and trying to like minimize the amount of imagination you bring to bear on
mm,
things, at least in obvious ways. I get the feeling that that's kind of where a lot of the energy for the people a generation younger than me is.
yeah.
And then also there's this great interest in big, fantasy with fire breathing dragons and stuff. And,
Yeah. Yes.
I don't think the prose is such that, and the level of complexity is such that it's often aiming at literature. But I know that that's exciting for young people. I've kind of always been interested in this region in between where like, the imagination
Mm,
and the capacity to build worlds and to, you know, engage with alternate lives and other experiences and experimental selves is disciplined by some kind of fidelity to the texture of lived life. And that tends to produce, for me, you know, kind of these big maximalist um, projects. And that's just the only thing I feel called to write. So I'm not sure who's out there who's doing what I'm doing,
mm,
you know, who's my age or younger, but I hope to find them and connect. But as I said, like I'm happy to read all kinds of things. Like, I love 140 page auto fiction. I love what Valeria Luiselli is doing.
mm.
Um, I love all kinds of things. So
So now that you mentioned this progress of digital media, so I was interested in the one aspect of the novel City on Fire, these independent magazines, these fanzines,
yeah,
like these
yeah.
punks. So maybe drawing some parallels for today, some places like Twitter, Reddit, or this 4chan. It's very popular in Japan, for example. So how did you perceive this kind of evolution of this subculture media from fanzine to, for example, today's digital publication?
Well, here's the difference.
Mm,
Um, and it's not a binary, it's a continuum,
mm,
right? So it's not like, either a publication has this or doesn't have it. But here's the continuum. The continuum is about the difficulty, the amount of work that you have to put in to do it, the barrier to entry that creates, but also the commitment that it creates. So the culture, the kind of analog punk culture that I came up in, I grew up in, you know, the late 80s, the 90s, that really had its roots in the 60s and 70s and even the 50s, which was a culture of, you know, zines, like handmade, like mimeographed fanzines, and letterpress, you know, books and small presses and mixtapes, and, you know, independent music. That analog culture, it was open in the sense that the internet is supposed to be open. I mean, you were freer to participate in it than you are in a world that's controlled by corporate publishers and corporate record labels. But the cost to participate was hours of work.
Yeah.
So you could put together a band and you could rehearse your band to a certain level, and you could raise $500 from friends, and you could put out an album, and then, you know, your fans could you know, copy the tape, put it in the mail, send it to another person. And what you see in City on Fire is that builds this connection among strangers that's somewhat similar to the internet and digital culture, meaning, you know, Samantha doesn't know William. And then Samantha and Charlie are bonded because they've, you know, he's read her zine or whatever. And as the kind of utopian idea of the internet has changed to the kind of corporate hellscape that it is now, like, there's no barrier to entry really to broadcasting your thoughts. But you can do it in like 30 seconds. It's what Trump does, right? Like, he's not thinking, he's no evil genius behind his tweets. He's just having an impulse and he tweets it and then it goes out. But like, the quality sucks. And then nobody cares about it tomorrow because no work went into it. Yeah. So a healthy culture has to combine openness, like an open invitation to everyone, a democratic reach, with some kind of demand that it's making on the person trying to communicate something, to have that thing be, you know, as best it can be. You and I are spending, you know, we're now 32 minutes into an interview. Like, you took time to read my book. You're going to transcribe this interview. You're still operating in a world where you're taking advantage of the openness of the internet, but you're combining it with some desire to work, to communicate. And I really appreciate that. There was a great blog in Mexico City called Hermano Cerdo, Pig Brother.
I don't know it, but
from like 2010-ish. And we used to correspond. I was part of a kind of group blog called The Millions, and we used, you know, it was just this era. That was a cool little moment.
Yeah, so it's, yeah, on the other side, actually, there's this character also that caught my attention, maybe this parallel with today, this radio program of Dr. Zig Ziglar. This kind of similar to this, engaging in this like conspiracy theory podcast, like, yeah, this
that's interesting.
with alternative narratives. So yeah, it's like similar to maybe the paranoia and today's digital misinformation. That's kind of, yeah, but maybe today is easier just to put your microphone and start talking to whatever, yeah, people want to listen.
Well, and I think what the novel sort of discovers is that when you have that ability to have democratic reach, one of the kinds of things that's the most compelling, both to the reader or listener and to the person making the thing, is, you know, these kind of fever dreams or whatever. So maybe that's part of why they spread so quickly. They're so popular on the internet.
Like you mentioned this probably a difference in the effort that you have to put to if you want to convey some ideas or make some kind of activism. So, for example, today, like there's a lot of people who thinks that maybe there's some apathy or yeah, in the society and political indifference, for example. So, and in the novel, for example, this anarchist, this punks group, so trying this kind of some activism with the music, with the fanzine, with this, even with this radical violence. So nowadays, what kind of group? So who do you think took this place now
Mm.
for this kind of old anarchists, for example? Well,
Oh, I mean, that's a really good question. And that's another one where I feel like as I get older, I have less of a sense
mm,
of what's going on. When I was in the early 2000s, um, I was kind of on the periphery of a group in Washington, D.C. called Positive Force,
mm,
um, which was very involved in the music scene. And it was a radical group, but it was like, it was interesting. It had this kind of liberation theology, Catholicism running through
mm,
it. And so that as they were radical, it was like, let's stop, just complaining and trying to tear shit down and let's focus on what we can build, like what we can do. And so
mm,
they put together, programs to like deliver meals to like, people like the victims of gentrification, basically like poor elderly people who were like shut into their apartments in DC. And, all these like incredible initiatives and, like the band Fugazi was involved in that. I'm sure that that sort of thing is still happening at a local level, like
mm.
outside of the spotlight. Um, in the spotlight, I think there's a lot of like, um, I think that there remains a healthy radical streak in people's politics, but I just think there's this kind of consumerism that's inflected everybody, no matter what your politics are, as though, you just when you're frustrated with something, you just tweet
Mm.
and then move on.
Yeah.
So I don't know as far as like direct action, whether it's direct action destroying things or direct action building things, at least in America right now, like or in New York, like it's hard for me, just as a writer and someone raising a family to really say where I think that is because I'm sure it's there. I just, it's happening outside of the spotlight.
Yeah, now you mentioned the identification problems. So yeah, now in Mexico City, there's this kind of big problem with a lot of these called digital nomads coming from all over the world
Yeah,
to
yeah.
displace this kind of
Not just Mexico City, like everywhere.
yeah, probably right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are some people that advocate actually for kind of violence or yeah, like extreme measures to stop this kind of situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and I mean, I think the novel makes clear my perception, not my
True.
judgment, my
Mm,
perception of where that leads, which is
yeah.
nowhere good.
Mm,
But that does, but that doesn't mean that like, that you just lie down and accept the digital
yeah.
overlord that come because it's not just that I lived in Barcelona for a while in
Mm,
2016 and I saw the same. I mean, I was in some sense, I was a digital nomad. I was writing, I
yeah,
could
right.
go live there for a while,
Mm,
right? But like the techies in particular,
mm,
you know, and the Airbnb people,
mm.
I could see that that was putting pressure on the city. So it's a real problem, but I'm just a novelist. I don't know what the solution is. I mean, Thomas Piketty, the French sociologist, would say the real solution
Mm,
is a radical restructuring of the tax code.
I see. It's
Like,
probably
like,
right. Yeah.
well, I mean, like taxes are just so boring is the problem. You can't get people to pay attention to them.
Mm, mm,
But I think, his thesis is like these great pools of mobile capital have been created by like just a global ratcheting down of the tax regime. So I don't know. You can't
That's
build that with an anarchist collective, though. You can't write tax code in an anarchist collective.
I see. And now that this kind of the punk idea, there's a very big theme in your novel. So were you thinking about this kind of chaotic or like this energetic nature of the punk scene while making the structure of your novel? So your novel has this kind of narrative and also some kind of pamphlets or pictures or this kind of different kind of format and then the different kind of points of views. So were you thinking about this kind of giving some kind of punk vibe to your novel also?
So structurally,
Mm,
the novel is actually it's sort of the opposite. It's very classically structured. So the structure is sort of taken from Dickens and
mm,
also from Bolaño, and what,
I see.
and like particularly 2666, and from what Bolaño took from, his antecedents. Where the punk energy shows up besides the zine is in the last movement of the book,
Mm,
which
mm,
is the blackout.
mm, mm,
The way that that's told has a kind of anarchic
mm,
punk energy, but that's the culmination of an energy that's kind of bubbling through the book, but it's not in the structure, it's in the language.
mm,
And the way that the language is punk is that it is this collision and smashing together of like high and low, of like, music and dissonance, of, you know, the Ramones, when you listen to them, are like half of it's like the Beach Boys, it's pure pop music, and half of it's this like aggressive
mm,
thing. So that in the language is to me that's where I was thinking about trying to be punk in the book.
mm,
The length of the book is sort of a punk rock gesture because it's just like something that I thought made it unpublishable by like corporations while I
mm,
was writing it. And so there was a kind of, you know, F you, fuck you energy to
mm,
that. Um, and then the third thing is that the kind of the energy that you talked about in the New York punk scene of the 70s in particular, to me sounds like this kind of dialectic of creation and
mm,
destruction. Like people think about punk as just being this kind of like tear it down, destructive energy. But the New York punk scene, the band Television with these long, beautiful guitar solos that are structured like a cathedral, or Patti Smith, doing this kind of like invocation of the muses is very much about creation as well. So like creation and destruction. And that dyad is at work inside the characters and it's at work inside what I'm seeing in the city. And so the vision of the novel is punk. The language of the novel is punk. The structure of the novel is like,
classic.
yeah, very classical to kind of offset that until the blackout when it all kind of
Mm.
blows into a million bits of glass.
But even though if it's like a classic structure, at least in my appreciation, I feel that you try to combine different kind of genres also, like coming of age novel, a thriller, or even chronic for like maybe journalism in novels. So it was also your goal to try to use different kind of genres in
I
the.
think it was my goal to penetrate the surface of those genres,
Mm,
to see deeply enough into them
mm,
to recognize that underneath they're all the same genre. When you read Dickens, when you
mm,
read Dostoevsky,
mm,
when you read, just to reach from again, Bolaño, those big novels of all three, those are murder mysteries. Bleak
mm,
House is a murder mystery.
mm,
Brothers Karamazov is a murder mystery. So they're all genre. They're
mm,
also all coming of age novels.
yes, yeah.
Like they're also all love stories.
Mm,
They're also all, in some sense, historic novels. So, like the novel, particularly the kind of larger novel, once it gets past about 300 pages, like the novel, I mean, the classic novel, not just the punk rock novel, sort of like starts to dissolve those categories. And so, to the degree that that's a punk rock move, it's a punk rock move that people have been doing since Cervantes.
Yeah, it's also, yeah, Cervantes tried to include this kind of different genres, right? From different perspective, probably.
Could we do one more maybe and wrap?
Yeah.
Does that work
So
for you?
yeah, of course. Yeah, it's almost 1 hour. Sorry. Yeah. So yeah, probably for wrapping up. So it's not still in Spanish, your next book. Well, actually, the actual book that you are now recently going to have the second coming. But yeah, it's actually also a very big book. So yes, a lot of a challenge for the writer, of course, and for the reader. So do you think now
And,
that,
and for the translator.
of course, yeah, the translator. Hey, do you know the translator?
No, no, no. I just mean like so it's harder to get a big book translated because the translation costs are high. It's a lot of work for a translator.
So do you intend that also when writing City on Fire and this second coming that trying to go against this probably recent trends for going to the minimalism? It's very short books, short chapters, maybe even aphorisms.
Well, that's that I yeah, I know what you're talking. That's kind of what I was gesturing to earlier when I said, even though I don't really know what's going on literarily, like I do feel like there's a kind of resurgence, a kind of new energy in
Mhm.
going in minimalist directions in the last 10 years or so. Um, it's not that I consciously go against it. I just can only be who I am. And I just fundamentally, there's something not very minimalist about me, I think. This new book, I actually didn't realize that it was long. I mean, I thought it's not that long. It's like it's not any longer than like Franzen's books or um, I can think of a lot of books that are Antonio Munoz
Mhm.
Molina or someone like that. Like I think it's about 575 pages in English, but I thought it was like 400 and something,
Okay.
until it was set up in type, and I was like, oh, I guess this one's pretty long too. I just had to take the amount of space it took to get, you know, like the City on Fire is like a journey outward. This book is a journey inward. And I just had to take the amount of time it took to get all the way to the bottom of these characters. And however long it took me to get the reader to the last section, which for me is like the best thing I've ever done. I was just going to have to take that time.
Yeah, hopefully it will be released soon for all the Spanish speaker readers.
Yeah, I
So,
hope so.
so thank you very much, Garth. So I really appreciate your time. So I know you're
Okay.
very busy, so
All
yeah,
right.
it was kind of exciting for having this talk.
Great.
So yeah, hopefully we can talk again later. So
Okay.
see you
Yeah, when
soon.
the Spanish comes out.
Okay.
All
Thank you
right.
very much. Bye
Thank
bye.
you. All right.
See you.
Ciao.
Bye.